I have lived in Caldwell Flats for 41 years, and I have watched a great many things happen on its one paved street and its four unpaved ones. And I can tell you with the confidence of a man who has set more broken bones and delivered more difficult news than he cares to count that most of what people call a turning point isn't one at all. Most of what gets remembered as the moment everything changed was really just the last in a long chain of ordinary moments that nobody paid attention to at the time. The moment everything changed in Caldwell Flats was a plate of salt pork and cornbread left on a back step in October of 1884. I know that sounds like nothing. It was nothing to look at. But I've had 40 years to follow the chain back from where it ended. From the afternoon Clem Daughtry walked out of the circuit courtroom in Harker's Ford with the Harrow Creek water rights in the county's name, and the syndicate's lawyer standing in the yard with his hat in his hands and nothing else. And every time I follow it back, I end up at that same back step, at that same plate, and at Nora Weld saying his name out loud in a town that had decided he wasn't worth the air. My name is Orrin Hatch. I was the doctor in Caldwell Flats from 1876 until I retired in 1901. I am 81 years old now, and my hands shake and my eyes are going, but my memory is intact, and I want this written down correctly before I'm not here to correct anyone. I'll start where it started. Clem Daughtry came to Caldwell Flats in the spring of 1882. And he came the way a lot of men came to small Wyoming towns in those years, quietly, with one bag and no explanation. He was 42 years old, lean and weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something better, serious and particular, with pale gray eyes that moved over a room the way a surveyor's transit moves over a ridgeline, measuring everything and giving nothing back. He found work almost immediately, not good work. Clem Daughtry did not find good work in Caldwell Flats or anywhere in those first years. He did the work that was left when other men had taken what they wanted, the fence mending, the cellar digging, the hauling, the kind of jobs that needed muscle and patience and an absence of pride. He was good at all of it. He was quiet about all of it. He slept in a tack room that Ezra Purvis rented him for $2 a month, which was an act of borderline generosity on Purvis's part that I always suspected he regretted, since Clem's presence at the edge of his property made the other men uneasy. That unease was the thing I could never quite make sense of in those early months. Clem Daughtry had not done anything to earn it. He had not stolen, had not drunk to excess, had not brawled, had not failed to pay what he owed. He kept himself clean, spoke little, and did what he was hired to do without complaint and without error. By any ordinary measure, he was an ideal transient laborer, the sort of man a frontier town ought to be grateful to have. But Caldwell Flats was not grateful. Caldwell Flats had decided something about Clem Daughtry early, and once a small town decides something, the decision tends to harden like concrete in cold weather. What it decided was this, that he was a ruin. The word came from Harlan Kress, who ran the feed store and who had a talent for a memorable phrase that he used almost exclusively in the service of cruelty. "There goes the ruin," Harlan would say, when Clem walked past the store on his way to whatever work he had that day, and the men sitting on the bench out front would nod or laugh or say nothing, which amounts to the same thing. The word spread. Children picked it up the way children pick up anything that adults use with obvious satisfaction. By the summer of 1882, there was not a person in Caldwell Flats who did not know that the man in Purvis's tack room was called the Ruin, and most of them used it. I did not use it. I want to be clear about that. I was the town's doctor, and I had opinions about the human body's capacity for damage and repair that made me cautious about writing any man off as past use. But I also did not correct anyone who used it in my presence, and I did not go out of my way to treat Clem Daughtry any differently than the town did. I nodded to him when we passed. I did not invite him in. I was, to my lasting shame, a man of my community in this regard when I should have been better. Nora Weld was better. She had been the postmistress in Caldwell Flats since her husband Edgar died of a lung fever in 1880, leaving her with the post office contract, a small house on the north end of Fetter Street, and $200 in debts that she paid off in 14 months by taking in sewing on top of her post office duties. She was 36 years old in 1882, which in the accounting of Caldwell Flats made her practically elderly for a widow. The town had decided she was not going to remarry, with the same certainty with which it had decided that Clem Daughtry was a ruin, and it was wrong about both things, though it would take years to find that out. Nora Weld was not a dramatic woman. She was not the kind of woman you wrote poems about, or at least not the kind of poems that get written down. She was steady and quiet and clear-eyed, and she ran the post office with a precision that the county postal inspector once told me was the best operation he supervised in 3 counties. She kept her house clean and her accounts straight and her word whole, and she had a way of looking at a situation that stripped away everything unnecessary until she could see what the thing actually was. It was this quality, this refusal to take other people's accounting of a thing as the final accounting, that separated her from the rest of Caldwell Flats. She did not call Clem Daughtry the ruin, not because she was making a statement about it, not because she had any particular intelligence about him at that point. She simply had a rule, which I learned later she'd had since she was a girl, that she would not call a person by a name they hadn't chosen, and that was the end of it for her. The plate of salt pork and cornbread happened in October of 1882, which was the second autumn Clem Daughtry spent in Caldwell Flats. He was doing a job for her that day, rehanging a gate on the south side of her property that had come loose in the August wind and had never quite sat right since. He arrived at 7 in the morning as she'd asked. He worked steadily through the morning without a break, tearing out the old hinges and resetting the posts and rehinging the whole gate properly, which took longer than a lesser man would have bothered with, but which Nora noticed and would have noticed even if he hadn't. By noon he had finished. He was gathering his tools when Nora came out the back door with a plate covered by a cloth and a cup of coffee. "Sit down a minute," she said, and gestured toward the steps. Clem looked at the plate and the cup and then at her, with those measuring gray eyes, and I imagine what he was looking for was the thing that usually came with an offer like that from people in this town, the condition, or the pity, or the faint superiority of a decent person extending charity toward someone beneath them. He didn't find it in her face because it wasn't there. "Thank you," he said, and sat down on the step. She set the plate down beside him, salt pork, cornbread, a spoonful of preserved beans, and left the coffee cup on the step above, and then she sat down on the step beside him and ate her own noon meal, which was the same thing, because she was not a woman who kept 2 kinds of food for 2 kinds of people. They sat in silence for a while. The wind was coming off the high plain to the north and it smelled of coming cold. After a few minutes Nora said, "You do good work, Mr. Daughtry." He looked at her sidelong, still chewing. "Clem," he said. "Clem," she said, "you do good work." "Thank you," he said. That was the whole of it. He finished eating, thanked her again, collected what she owed him for the gate, which she paid from a small tin she kept in her apron pocket, counting it out exactly and not requiring change, and walked back down Fetter Street. I happened to be coming out of Cully Marsh's house across the way, where I'd been treating a carbuncle on Cully's neck, and I saw the whole thing from the gate. I remember thinking that it was an ordinary enough act of hospitality from a decent woman, and that was correct, and that was also the entirety of what I understood about it at the time, which tells you something about the limits of my understanding. I know now, having had 40 years to look at it, that for Clem Daughtry, in that particular year, in that particular town, being called by his own name, and being fed the same food as the woman feeding him was not ordinary at all. It was the only human decency he had received in Caldwell Flats in 18 months. That is not an exaggeration. That is a fact I established later by talking to people who knew him in those years, and by being honest with myself about what I had and hadn't done. He didn't forget it. That matters. Some men would have taken the meal and the name and moved on because they were practiced at receiving small kindnesses and letting them go. Clem Daughtry was not that kind of man. He was the other kind, the kind that carries a ledger in his chest, not from bitterness but from a deep, bone-level belief that the world should account for itself properly, that what is given ought to be returned, and that a debt of kindness is the only debt that truly demands payment. He filed the plate, and the name and the fact that she had sat beside him rather than above him, and he kept them. I need to tell you about the Harrow Creek situation, because without it the rest of this doesn't make sense. Harrow Creek was the watershed that fed Caldwell Flats and the 6 ranches on its eastern and southern reaches. It wasn't a large creek. You could jump it in a dry year in 3 places, but it was ours, and it had been reliably ours since the first settlers came in 1871, because the land grant and the county plat had always shown the watershed as belonging to the common use of the Caldwell Flats district. In 1883, a land speculation and railroad development syndicate out of St. Louis, called the Meridian Western Company, began buying up property along the potential route of a northern spur line they were hoping to run through the Wyoming high plains. They were quiet about it at first, buying through local agents, using shell names, not announcing what they were assembling. And by the time anyone in Caldwell Flats understood what was happening, the Meridian Western Company had acquired 4 parcels of land along the upper Harrow Creek watershed and had begun filing claims with the territory's land office that, if granted, would have given them effective control of the water supply for the entire district. The man they sent to Caldwell Flats in the spring of 1883 was named Pollard. He was well-dressed and pleasant, and he spoke about progress and the future of Wyoming and the benefits of rail connection. And he met with the town council in Rufus Meade's feed office and laid out what Meridian Western wanted and what it was prepared to offer in exchange, which was essentially the opportunity to sell out on terms slightly better than what they would eventually get if the town refused, and the company pursued its legal claims to completion. The town council was Rufus Meade, Harlan Kress, and 2 ranchers named Dobie Fitch and Cal Purdy. They were not stupid men. They understood what Pollard was offering, and they understood what it would mean to lose control of Harrow Creek. But they also did not have a lawyer, and the territory was a long way from the kind of legal muscle that could go up against a St. Louis syndicate. And Pollard's manner was smooth and certain in the way that men are smooth and certain when they know the law is on their side. The council wrote 2 letters, one to the county seat asking about legal resources, and one to a land attorney in Laramie. They received polite replies indicating that the situation was complicated, and that the costs of contesting the claims would be substantial, and that the outcome was uncertain. They began to talk, in the cautious way of frightened men, about what kind of deal they might be able to negotiate with Meridian Western that would leave them some water and some dignity. It was Harlan Kress who said, at a council meeting I was not present at but which I heard about in detail from Rufus Meade afterward, that they ought to at least consult someone who knew surveying, since the whole thing turned on the land descriptions and the plat records, and whether the watershed boundary was drawn where Meridian Western said it was, or where the original county plat had shown it to be. Who do we have for that? Dobie Fitch said. There was a pause. There's the ruin, Harlan Kress said, and then laughed, and then stopped laughing because nobody else was laughing, and because they all knew it was actually the only name any of them had. Clem Daughtry had been an army surveyor. This was known in town in the vague way that things are known in small towns. People were aware of it without quite knowing how they'd come to be aware, and they had not attached much significance to it because they had decided he was a ruin, and surveyors were not ruins, those being mutually exclusive categories. But in the meeting room at Rufus Meade's feed office, with Meridian Western's legal claims sitting on the table between them. The word surveyor suddenly carried weight. Rufus Meade sent his son over to Purvis's tack room to ask Clem Daughtry if he would come and look at some documents. I was in my office when Clem walked past my window heading toward Rufus's place. I watched him go. He was wearing the same clothes he always wore, the work jacket, the practical boots, the hat that had seen better years, but there was something in the way he was walking that I had not seen before. A stillness, maybe, as if he had been waiting a long time for someone to ask him something and had not let himself believe they would. He looked at Meridian Western's filings for 20 minutes. Then he looked at the original county plat. Then he said, quietly and without triumph, "Their watershed line is wrong." "How wrong?" Rufus Meade said. "Wrong enough," Clem said. "Their eastern boundary cuts through the secondary drainage at a bearing of 47 degrees northeast. The county plat runs it at 39 degrees. That 11-degree difference puts their upper parcels outside the watershed boundary. They don't own what they say they own." The men around the table looked at each other. "You sure about that?" Dobie Fitch said. "I've been sure about it for 8 months, Clem said. The room went quiet. "You've been surveying the watershed," Rufus Meade said. "I've been surveying the whole district," Clem said. "Since last June, I have field notes. I have triangulation points. I can produce a survey document that a circuit court would accept." He paused. "I wasn't sure anyone was going to need it. I did it because it needed doing. I want to stop here and tell you something, because it matters." When Rufus Meade told me about this conversation later that same evening, sitting in my office with a glass of whiskey he needed badly, he said, "Orrin, the man has been out there on his own time with his own tools for 8 months, surveying a watershed he's got no legal claim to and no financial stake in because he thought it needed doing." He shook his head. "Why would he do that?" I thought about it for a moment. "What did he say when you asked him?" "He said he lives here," Rufus said. I didn't have an answer for Rufus that night. I've had 40 years to think about it since, and the best answer I've arrived at is this. Clem Daughtry had a code, and the code said that a man did what needed doing in the place where he lived, regardless of what that place thought of him. It was not about recognition. It was not about reward. It was about the fact that the work was there and he could do it and therefore he ought to. He had carried that code through an army that had broken his career on a false account. I learned the details of that later, and I'll tell them in a moment. And through 2 years in a town that called him a ruin to his face, and it had not bent or cracked or worn thin. And I think that is one of the more remarkable things I observed in 41 years of watching human beings. Now let me tell you about the Army matter, because it is relevant to understanding Clem Daughtry fully, and it is also relevant to understanding why Nora Weld's decency meant what it meant. Clem had been a survey sergeant with the Army Corps of Engineers in the early 1870s, working the Wyoming and Montana territories. He was good at it, better than good. By the accounts of the men who served with him, he was exceptional, with a natural precision and patience for field work that the Corps recognized and made use of. He was given progressively more responsible assignments. He was put in charge of a survey party charting the Upper Powder River Basin in 1874. In the spring of 1875, one of the officers over him, a lieutenant named Graves, made an error in a survey that established the boundaries of a land grant being assembled by a group of investors with political connections. The error was Graves's. Clem caught it and reported it to Graves directly, believing, as a man with his code would believe, that a mistake reported was better than a mistake allowed to stand. Graves chose a different interpretation. He filed a report attributing the error to Clem, who was not an officer and had no standing to contest the account of one who was. Clem was dishonorably discharged. Graves was promoted 18 months later. I know this because Clem told me. He told me not to explain himself or to seek sympathy, but because I asked directly, during a conversation we had in my office in the fall of 1883, after the council meeting, when I was trying to understand who he was. He told it without bitterness and without drama, in the same tone in which he might have described the bearing angle of a survey line, and when he had finished he said, "I was right about the boundary and Graves was wrong and the record says the opposite. I can't change the record. What I can do is the work. What I can do is the work." That was the whole of his philosophy, stated in 8 words, and I have thought about those 8 words more than almost anything else anyone has ever said in my presence. The council voted, after 2 days of argument, to engage Clem Daughtry to produce a formal survey document, and to retain a Laramie attorney to file a counterclaim against Meridian Western's water rights petition with the Territory Land Office. The vote was 3-1, with Harlan Kress as the dissent. Harlan's objection was not, as far as I could determine, based on any substantive doubt about Clem's competence. It was based on the fact that Harlan Kress had called the man a ruin for 2 years and was not prepared to be wrong about it. The attorney in Laramie was named Beaumont, and he was the right choice, methodical, experienced with territorial land law, and willing to work for a fee the council could actually scrape together if every property owner in the district contributed, which they did, in amounts ranging from $4 to $40, depending on what they had. Nora Weld contributed $12, which was more than I expected, and which she paid from the same small tin in her apron pocket that she used for everything else. I know because I was with her when the collection came around, and I saw her count it out. Clem Daughtry worked through that fall and winter on the formal survey document. He worked alone. He had good instruments, a transit and a chain he'd kept from his Army years, maintained with the same care he brought to everything, and he was methodical and precise, and he produced a document that Beaumont later described to me as the finest piece of private survey work he had seen filed in a territorial proceeding. The document ran to 47 pages, including field notes, triangulation records, and a set of hand-drawn plat maps that were clear enough that a circuit judge with no technical training could follow them. He finished the document in January of 1884 and delivered it to Beaumont by mail. He did not charge the council for the work. This caused another argument. Rufus Meade told me Clem had refused payment 3 times and on the 3rd refusal had simply walked out, which closed the matter in the practical sense while leaving the moral one unresolved in Rufus's mind. I told Rufus that some men are like that and he should accept it as a gift and be grateful. "But why?" Rufus said. "What does he get out of it?" I thought about what Clem had said in my office. "He lives here," I said. During those winter months, Nora Weld did something that I only understood in its full significance much later. She had the keys to the post office, which meant she received and dispatched all mail for the district. She also had, as postmistress, access to the postal map archives, a set of old territorial survey records that the Postal Service used for establishing delivery routes, which had been filed with the post office when Caldwell Flats was designated a postal station in 1873. These records were not the county plat, and they were not legal survey documents, but they were independent historical records of the district's boundaries that predated Meridian Western's acquisitions by 11 years. Nora went through these records in the evenings, after the post office closed, and identified 3 sets of descriptions that supported Clem's survey findings and contradicted Meridian Western's claimed watershed boundary. She wrote them up in a clear summary and sent them to Beaumont in Laramie by registered mail, with a note explaining who she was and why she believed the records were relevant. Beaumont wrote back immediately. He found the postal records valuable, not dispositive on their own, but useful as corroborating historical evidence that he incorporated into the filing. Nora did not tell anyone in Caldwell Flats she had done this. She told me about it years later in the course of a longer conversation, and when I asked her why she hadn't mentioned it at the time, she said she didn't think it was her place to draw attention to her own contributions while the council was doing what it needed to do. She said she saw something in the records that might help, and so she sent it. That was all. Did Clem know? I said. I told him, she said. I sent him a note. What did he say? She smiled slightly. He said thank you, she said, the same way he said it on the back step. I thought about that for a while. That's the same currency, I said. Yes, she said. The Territory Land Office scheduled the hearing for May of 1884 to be held before the circuit judge in Harker's Ford, which was the county seat and about 40 miles from Caldwell Flats. Pollard came back to town in March. He was still pleasant, still well-dressed, but there was a new precision to his pleasantness, the kind that a man deploys when he has been made aware that he is in a tighter spot than he thought and is recalculating. He met again with the council, this time without the broad strokes of his first visit, asking specific questions about the survey work and the attorney and the filing. He offered to settle on terms that were significantly better than his original proposal. Meridian Western would retain 2 of the 4 parcels and cede the watershed access entirely, in exchange for a payment to the district of $400. The council met that evening. I was present this time, at Rufus's invitation, since Rufus had taken to wanting a witness at these things. Harlan Cress said they should take the settlement. He said Beaumont was a Laramie lawyer, and Laramie was a long way from Harker's Ford, and they were counting on a survey done by a man they'd called a ruin for 2 years, and he didn't like the odds. Dobie Fitch said that $400 was good money, and they ought to consider it. Cal Purdy said he wanted to hear what Clem thought. Rufus Meade sent for Clem. Clem came in, stood at the end of the table, and listened while Rufus laid out the offer. When Rufus finished, there was a silence. What does Beaumont say? Clem asked. He says the case is strong, Rufus said. He says he wouldn't take the settlement. Then I wouldn't take it either, Clem said. You're sure the survey holds? Harlan Cress said, with the tone of a man who was hoping the answer was no. Clem looked at him for a moment. I have thought about that look many times. It was not hostile. It was not triumphant. It was simply the look of a man measuring a situation exactly as it was with those gray transit eyes and finding it straightforward. The survey holds, Clem said. The bearing angles are documented. The triangulation points are monumented and can be rerun by any competent surveyor Meridian Western wants to bring in. The postal records Mrs. Weld identified corroborate the historical boundary. Beaumont has a solid case. He paused. You hired me to tell you what I know. That's what I know. The council voted to reject the settlement. Harlan Cress was again the dissent. Pollard left the next morning. I watched him go from the window of my office and thought, not for the first time, that the man had badly underestimated Caldwell Flats, though to be fair, so had most of Caldwell Flats. The hearing in Harker's Ford was in the last week of May. Beaumont had filed the survey document, the postal records, and an additional corroborating document that Clem had found, a field journal from an 1872 Army engineering survey of the Powder River country, which included a passing triangulation reference to the Harrow Creek watershed that supported the county plat's bearing description. Clem had found this journal at the Territorial Archive in Cheyenne during a trip he made in February, paying for the stage himself, and arriving back 2 days later with a copy he had made by hand overnight. I was among the group that went to Harker's Ford for the hearing. Rufus Meade, Dobie Fitch, Cal Purdy, and 4 of the ranchers on the South Watershed came. Nora Weld came. Harlan Cress did not. Clem testified for 2 hours. He was precise, patient, and entirely without affect, which I think was one of the most effective things about him as a witness. Meridian Western's lawyers tried 3 times to rattle him or catch him in an imprecision, and each time he simply repeated the measurement and cited the triangulation point and the field note, as though the uncertainty they were trying to manufacture was not present in the room, because in fact it was not. The circuit judge, whose name was Aldous Fearn, and who had the bearing of a man who had sat through many proceedings, and could tell the difference between genuine technical expertise and its imitation, asked Clem several questions directly, and received answers that clearly satisfied him. The Meridian Western lawyers put their own expert on, a surveyor from Denver, who gave a different set of bearing measurements for the watershed boundary. Beaumont cross-examined him for an hour, using Clem's field notes and the Army Journal reference, and established that the Denver surveyor's measurements could not be reconciled with the 1872 Army reference points, which were a fixed historical record. The Denver surveyor did not have a good answer for this. Judge Fearn took a recess. We sat in the yard outside the courthouse, in the May afternoon, which was warm and smelled of blooming sage and horse, and the particular dry dust smell of the Wyoming high plains in a good spring. Rufus Meade was quieter than I had ever seen him. The ranchers talked among themselves in low voices. Nora Weld sat apart from the group on a bench near the courthouse wall, reading, which was what Nora did when she was waiting because she was too practical to sit idle. I went over and sat beside her. "How do you think it's going?" I said. She considered. "I think Clem was right about the survey, and Judge Fearn can tell that he was right," she said. "I think that's probably enough." "You seem calm," I said. "I've been calm about this since last October," she said. I looked at her. "Since October?" "Since Clem delivered the gate work," she said. "I knew what he was capable of then. A man who rebuilds a gate properly when he could have done it adequately is a man whose other work is right." I thought about that. "You hired him to rebuild a gate," I said, "and from that you concluded that his watershed survey would hold up in circuit court." "Yes," she said. "That's a considerable inference," I said. "It's the same information," she said, and went back to her book. Judge Fearn returned in the late afternoon. He ruled that Meridian Western's claimed watershed boundary was not supported by the documentary and survey record, that the county plat description was corroborated by the historical evidence and the petitioner's own survey document, and that the water rights of the Caldwell Flats district over the Harrow Creek watershed remained in the district's name. He dismissed Meridian Western's claim with prejudice. Pollard's lawyer received the ruling with a face that told you he had suspected this outcome for some weeks and had not found a way to tell his clients. He collected his papers and his hat and walked out of the courthouse yard without speaking to anyone. We stood in the May afternoon in a kind of stunned quiet, which is the thing that often follows good news when it has been waited for a long time with genuine uncertainty. The relief is too large to make noise about right away. Rufus Meade shook Clem's hand and then seemed to not know what to do next, which was an unusual state for Rufus. Dobie Fitch and Cal Purdy did the same. The ranchers shook his hand in turn. Each one of them, I noticed, seemed slightly unable to look him in the eye for more than a moment. They were men who had laughed at the word ruin, or at least not objected to it, and the gratitude they felt was tangled up with something else that is not a comfortable thing to carry. Clem received all of it with the same quality he brought to everything, quietly, precisely, without either false modesty or satisfaction, like a man who had done a job he knew needed doing and was glad it was done. Then he turned and walked over to where Nora Weld was standing. I was watching from 15 feet away. I am glad I was watching. He stopped in front of her and took off his hat, which was the hat that had seen better years, and held it in both hands. He looked at her for a moment with those gray measuring eyes that were, for the first time in the 2 years I had known him, doing something other than measuring. They were still and certain, and carrying something that I did not have an adequate word for, though I have been trying to find one for 40 years. "Mrs. Weld," he said. "Clem," she said, just his name. The way she always said it, plain and decent and like it cost her nothing because it cost her nothing. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "In October of 1882, he said, "you brought a plate of food out to a back step and you sat down next to a man that this town had decided wasn't worth the bother. You called him by his name. You ate the same food." He stopped. "I don't think you knew what that was worth." Nora looked at him steadily. "I think I had some idea," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been carrying it since then," he said. "Everything I did, the survey, the archive, all of it. I kept thinking about how the creek is still here because you've got water rights, and you've got water rights because of what Beaumont filed, and what Beaumont filed works because the survey is right, and the survey got done because I was still in Caldwell Flats in the spring of 1883 when they needed someone who could do it." He paused. "I stayed in Caldwell Flats because of a plate of food and a man's name." Nora was quiet. "I know that's a large thing to put on a plate of salt pork," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost dry, almost wry, and which I recognized in that moment as the humor of a man who had kept it packed away for a very long time. Nora made a sound that was almost a laugh. "It was good salt pork," she said. "It was," he said. They stood looking at each other in the May afternoon, in the courthouse yard in Harker's Ford, with the sage smell and the dust, and the sound of horses, and the other men from Caldwell Flats giving them a wide berth without quite knowing why. "I would like to call on you," Clem said, "when we're back if you're willing." "I'm willing," Nora said. He put his hat back on. She picked up her book. They walked to the stage together. I watched them go, and I thought about what a strange and particular chain it was. How the creek was saved, and the town was saved, and 20 families kept whole, and a land syndicate from St. Louis turned back from a Wyoming high plains town that nobody in St. Louis had heard of, and how at the beginning of that chain was a woman sitting down on a back step with a plate of food, and saying a man's name like it mattered because she had decided it did. It was, I thought, the most ordinary, extraordinary thing I had ever witnessed. I should tell you how things turned out, because that is the honest business of a man who has said he wants this written down correctly. Clem Daughtry called on Nora Weld the following Sunday, and every Sunday after that through the summer and into the fall, and they married in December of 1884 in a ceremony at the Methodist church that was attended by essentially the entire district, including Harlan Kress, who stood in the back and did not speak to Clem but who was there, which I suppose counts for something. Clem was hired by the county the following spring as the district surveyor, an official position with an official wage, which was how Caldwell Flats acknowledged what it owed him without quite being able to say so directly. He held that position for 19 years, until his eyes began to go, and the county plat he produced in 1886 was still in use as the authoritative reference document when I retired in 1901. He and Nora had a good life together. I won't try to make it sound larger than it was. It was a quiet life and a particular one, built the same way Clem built everything, methodically, precisely, and with the kind of attention to the important joints that makes a thing last. They had a daughter born in 1886, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's quality of stripping away what was unnecessary until she could see the thing clearly, and who became a school teacher in 2 counties over, which suited her. Nora ran the post office until 1898, when she was 52, and then she handed it over to a young man she had trained carefully and went home to keep the accounts for the district surveyor's office, which is what she had been doing informally for years. The tin in her apron pocket was replaced by a proper ledger. Harlan Kress never publicly recanted the word ruin, but he stopped using it sometime in the winter of 1884, which was about as close as Harlan Kress could get to saying he had been wrong, and Clem seemed to regard it as sufficient, which told you something about the kind of man he was. I retired to a small house on the north end of Fetter Street, 3 houses down from where Nora and Clem lived, and in the summer evenings I sometimes sat on my porch and watched the light come off the high plains to the north and thought about all of it. The Harrow Creek still runs. The district still holds the water rights. The 6 ranches on the eastern and southern watershed are still there, third generation now, running cattle on land they would have lost if the Bering Angles had gone the wrong way. I think about the plate of salt pork. I think about the phrase the whole town had decided, and how a town deciding something about a person is one of the most powerful and one of the most frequently mistaken things a town can do, and how the mistake in this case was corrected not by argument or by confrontation, but by a woman who simply declined to participate in it, quietly and consistently, because she had a rule about names and a habit of looking at things as they were rather than as she had been told they were. I think about the gate, the way a man who is going to do something does it properly even when adequately would have done, the information that carries. I think about Nora on the courthouse bench, reading her book, saying she had been calm since October because a gate rebuilt properly is the same information as a survey document that holds up in court. I have been a doctor for 40 years, and I like to think I am a reasonably good reader of evidence. I was not as good a reader of evidence as Nora Weld, and I have made my peace with that. Caldwell Flats is larger now. There is a hardware store where Purvis's livery used to be, and a school on the West End that Nora helped raise money for in 1891, and a rail spur that comes within 8 miles and serves the district adequately without anyone from St. Louis owning the water. The street is paved all the way through now, not just the one stretch. The Harrow Creek watershed boundary is marked at its 4 corners by survey monuments that Clem Daughtry set himself in 1885, with a precision that his successor as district surveyor told me had never needed adjustment. I have walked to 3 of the 4 monuments over the years. They are heavy iron posts set in concrete, marked with the date and the Bering Angles, and they are, like everything Clem Daughtry ever built, exactly right. The last time I walked to one of them, I stood there for a while in the prairie wind, looking out at the Harrow Creek running below, and I thought about the back step and the plate and a woman sitting down beside a man and saying his name like it cost her nothing. What it cost her was nothing, what it built was everything. A man who knows what he owes and who keeps accounts the way Clem Daughtry kept accounts, not from bitterness but from the deep bone-level belief that the world ought to balance, will find a way to pay. It may take 2 years or 20. It may look from the outside like surveying alone in the cold for 8 months for a town that calls you a ruin, but the account will be settled. That is the only thing I know for certain after 81 years on this particular stretch of the high plains. The kindness returns. It always returns. And when Clem Daughtry took off his hat in the courthouse yard and called that woman's name the way she had called his, plain and decent, and like it meant everything because it did, the only surprising thing was that anyone was surprised. I was not surprised, not by then. I had watched him rebuild a gate.